ministries for the partnership with the Wiley lecture series. It's become a habit now, right, Red? Where we connect the Brewed Awakening series to the Wiley lecture series, and we ask the Wiley lecture speaker to let their hair down here and to come speak to us about something related to justice.
Good thing it's you.
So, yeah. So, Dr. Brad Kelly, would you please introduce?
Thanks so much. And just to return it, thanks to Dr. Gates and all the CJR folks for opening this venue. And as he said, what we want to do in these is give you a chance, if you want to get up close a little bit to the Wiley lecturer in some questions and conversation that you can't really have in the big lecture hall quite as well anyway, and to do so around one particular theme. So if you looked at the ads that went out about this event, you know that what we've picked up on is the theme of justice and the question of justice, particularly around the issue of how do we think from the various Christian perspectives about this thing called justice, the notion, the practice, and all of that. And if you've been around the church long at all, you know that there's a lot of talk around this question, and for some people, they feel worried or resistant in some ways to talk about justice, particularly social justice, as it's sometimes called. Other people feel like it is the discourse that the church ought to be having and engaging in, and sort of everything in between there. So we wanted to do a thing today where we kind of open up that conversation. And so the way we're going to go about it is I'm going to ask Dr. Benefiel for, if you haven't had a chance to be at any of the lectures, let me just bring you up to speed. Dr. Benefiel is not only the lecturer for this year, but happens to be the kind of brand new, I guess, dean of the School of Theology here at PLNU in his first year, and comes most directly from being the president of Nazarene Theological Seminary in Kansas City. Before that was a faculty member here, was pastor of Los Angeles First Church of the Nazarene back in the day. And it's got an incredible journey around the issues of the mission of the church and how this thing called justice fits into the mission of the church. So the way we're going to approach it is I'm going to ask Dr. Benefiel to start us off by just giving us a quick sort of, I guess you would say, a read of the landscape when it comes to thinking about justice. And then have Dr. Gates a chance to kind of respond to that landscape. And then right away, I'll just kind of play the role of moderator and start taking comments, questions, and hopefully back and forth we go. So I think you all are going to pass the mic back and forth as it is. And but Dr. Benefiel, start us off, if you would, with a few minutes worth of the landscape here.
Thanks, Brad. Just a point of personal privilege for a minute. As I look at all of you and knowing some of you who are outside of the Point Loma community who are participating and joining us here, it makes me want to extend the panel. And Jamie, that would be some of the people that you would know. Some of those who I know, just I'm going to point out, Robin Hyde here is pastor in San Bernardino, 3 locations, in I guess the best way to talk about it is hardcore urban ministry in San Bernardino in those locations, and really a leader, certainly within the Church of the Nazarene, in working for justice, but also primarily working in his ministries to among the poor. Someone mentioned that Dr. Jonathan Salgado in the back here is with us, and would be somebody who understands justice from many perspectives. And one of the things that most currently he's working on is that the former governor of Chiapas, Pablo Salazar, is a political prisoner in Chiapas. And Jonathan is if I can say this, the primary liaison with Pablo Salazar, and is working for his release in a multitude of ways. I think it's okay for me to say that.
Yes.
If it's not, it's too late now. And I was able to go with Dr. Salgado in November in visiting Pablo Salazar there in southern Chiapas, being held as a political prisoner. And also, see, I saw Tim and Shauna Gaines. Are they still, maybe he or she's preaching in chapel tomorrow, and they are recent grads, well, not so recent now, of Point Loma, who would be some of the great example of young Christian ministers advocating for social justice. So we could extend this, and I don't know if there's anybody else, while I'm mentioning, anybody else that you want to point out as visitors that we should recognize.
Just one really is a friend of mine, Rev Richard Lawrence, sitting here in front. I don't know if Reverend Lawrence, you mind waving your hand? For a couple of years actually, I had on my as a picture on my desktop a picture of Reverend Lawrence holding up a bank book out in front of one of the largest banks in Chicago as he's standing next to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And they're protesting the banks that would love to take the money of its black residents, but not allow them to open bank accounts and not give them access to the financial services. And so Reverend Lawrence has been a mentor of mine. I just want to say a special welcome there.
This conversation on justice and Christian ways to think about justice most recently comes out of a conversation that the three of us had over lunch. And it was such an engaging conversation that we had over lunch, we thought we would extend it and invite you into that conversation. And part of that goes back to, for me, goes back to some ways that I was stretched or challenged when I would begin using the language of justice. That for me, it meant something certainly very particular, especially around the language of social justice. But I began rethinking some of that. Part of that had to do when, back years ago when I was in Los Angeles, I was on the list that was invited to be on the radio program where there were different, a Catholic priest and a rabbi and a Protestant minister, and so I would be the Protestant minister and then talk for 2 hours on the radio, and then also on a TV program. And one time called Today's Religion, and one time there was the question is, how do you know what is moral? And I was surprised to hear the rabbi say, whatever is legal. And I thought, I don't think I agree with that. I don't think I agree with that. So that began to sort of stretch, and there's justice sort of thrown in with that. And then in a conversation with Sam Powell some time ago, where I threw out the language of justice, and he said, which kind of justice are you talking about? And it set me back and made me start thinking. For the last several years now, actually a course that I originally developed when I was a professor at Point Loma before going to seminary, that I've continued to teach on a regular basis and develop there at the graduate level. It's a course entitled Biblical Perspectives of Social Justice. And out of that, one of the things that I put on the table for students is this continuum of different ways that people might think about or define or talk about justice. And of those 5, basically the first one, and this is probably from right to left, if you will, that the first one is what we might call retributive or retribution, or an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. That justice is that evening things out, and in some ways taking things into my own hands to even things out. And in some ways, I think of that based on my years back in Los Angeles, that was in some ways the way that street gangs thought about justice, is getting even. And so you have this retributive justice. The second way that people often think about justice is what this rabbi, perhaps, the terms that he was thinking in, and that was whatever is legal. So you have legal justice. Legal justice might be whatever the law says. A third way of thinking about justice would be procedural justice. So still working sort of within the court system, only it's not just what the law says, it's due process. It's making sure that people have access to due process of the law. So that is more nuanced than just sort of a straight whatever the law says. A fourth, and this would be the category that I would generally assume, and when I'm teaching the class Biblical Perspectives of Social Justice, this is more the definition that I would be working from, and that would be systemic justice, or what we might talk about as far as distributive justice. And distributive justice is that the inequities in the social system that advantage some to the disadvantage of others that's basically based on power in the systems that are controlled by some to their own benefit. And basically the sociological principle is that people in power use their power to benefit themselves and those they represent. And so there is built into our society, or any society, there is this power dynamic that then also even controls not only the power dimensions of society, but also has the ability to control the perceptions of what is right. And so there are legitimacy structures that reinforce the power dynamics that then create this social injustice in society. In order to talk about distributive justice, we really need to talk about social systems, and the social systems that then are at work, and sometimes, almost in ways that are imperceptible, but they are very real in their effects. And so where there are social systems and then power, people have control over those systems, either directly or indirectly, then we have what we would call systemic injustice and the need for distributive justice, or redistributing the resources of society more fairly. Fourth, fifth, is what we would call reparative justice. We might also, let me see, that's the other one you mentioned, restorative. So reparative justice is maybe what John Perkins would talk about. John Perkins gives the idea, who's the person that Jamie mentioned it'll be one of the speakers at the conference coming up. He says, and he's African American, has been an advocate for social justice for decades. And as an African American speaking on behalf of many of the African American community in the United States, he would say it's really interesting to hear people say, okay, things weren't very just in the past, but we're going to quit doing that, and so then we're going to take care of it. He says it's sort of like a baseball game that's rigged. And it's rigged so that this team gets 27 outs and this team gets 2 outs. And isn't any surprise that the team that gets 27 outs per inning, that they've got a lot more runs. And at the bottom of the 8th inning, you say, okay, we're going to quit doing that because we realize that's not fair, and so we're going to make it 3 outs and 3 outs. But there's so much that's already gone before that is sort of not recognized. And so one of the things the way that people think, well, there was injustice in the past, but we're not like that anymore. And so now it's a fair society, and everybody says, it misses the effect of multi-generational discrimination in our society. And so restorative or reparative, restorative is finding ways to recognize the injustices of the past in ways that responds to those. Reparative is a more particular way of thinking about that, and the reparative, from time to time, there would be legislation that comes up in our society, specifically with regard to Native American population and or African American populations. And those have to do, does this society have some responsibility for the multi-generational discrimination, let's take for instance with African Americans, and what would that look like? What should that be monetary? Should that be affirmative action? Should that be some kind of action that tries to do some kind of work that's reparative or restorative, and not just working with regard to recognizing that we're going to quit doing that. So those are the 5. Jamie?
I think I'll come at this a little bit with a story, my own story. So I was raised as a missionary kid from the United States in apartheid South Africa, in a country that was, during my years there, heavily dominated by a small minority white population who controlled all of the resources of the country, the banking system, the education system, the politics, political situation. There was not a franchise for people who weren't white. In other words, everyone who voted everyone who had the right to vote were white. And so this was in the mostly the 80s that I was growing up in South Africa. This was very much the case all the way, in case everybody maybe knows the famous Nelson Mandela, who came to presidency in 1994. Long story what that context was like, but we knew that we experienced very directly South Africa as a sharply divided place all the time, sharply divided, and as a kid, not really recognizing how sharp the divisions had created deep injustices. As a white kid, I was carefully protected from a lot of the harsher realities that most South Africans went through on a regular basis. And as I think through these categories of justice, and I think through the biblical notions of justice, I think about the prophetic narratives and the way that they engage the systems and structures of their time, I remember as a kid, and as I reflected back on this, a kid being very blind to the kind of systemic and structural reasons why there was such great disparities between people. I didn't know. It was like there was a silence over what was, I couldn't even name what was happening. As you look at these different layers, I would argue that these different kinds of justice are also different layers or dimensions in some ways of justice. So, and in some ways, South Africans were able to compartmentalize their thinking about one another and about justice itself. So that good church-going folks, as a missionary kid, I'm going to church all the time, and the church never addressed the radical racial disparities and the role that people played in that system of privilege in any real significant way. So nobody was really talking about the restorative or the systemic or distributive forms of justice in church ever. Procedural justice, they would talk, well, that's the role of the government. Well, the government was profoundly corrupt. Right? Or they would talk about the legal forms of justice, which most of us, when we say justice, we think of the justice system, and we think of the court system, and we think of, and that quickly, that dimension seems to be the most tangible form. But in South Africa, growing up as a kid, that system was heavily turned and benefited one particular subpopulation over everyone else. So was that a just system? It's clearly not a just system. The voting system was clearly not a just system in any certain sense that sounded like biblical justice. The retributive justice, the police force and the military in South Africa, was heavily for the sake of a protected few. Right? So the way that the legal structure created punishment or a punitive system, a legal system that was retributive, seemed on the surface, if you were benefiting from that system, it seemed like it was just. If you were not benefiting from that system, it was profoundly unjust. And so, leave South Africa, come to college, come to seminary, come begin reflecting back over that experience. And the hardest part about reflecting on that experience was not recognizing apartheid as an evil structure and that there's sort of evil, in some ways, injustice sort of woven into that systemically, and beginning to understand the ways in which the systemic injustices were woven in the way that played out practically. That was a large part of my journey. But the hardest question along the way was, to what degree did the church participate in, or even was the church a part of the cause, the very fabric of the unjust systems? And so, coming to think through not just being able to name injustice, not just being able to define it and understand the systems that were in place, but beginning to think confessionally about where should we engage as Christians? How should we engage? Well, on the one side with justice, or on the other side against injustice. And is that the role of the church? And maybe that's something we can talk about this afternoon. In my life, apartheid wasn't just something that was written into legislation and written in the policies of their education system, their banking system, and in their police system. This is what I struggled with most. Apartheid was preached from the pulpit, often in very subtle ways, sometimes in very direct ways. And I'm wondering why the church is confessed. All churches in South Africa, all the denominations in South Africa confess their complicity in the apartheid system, in the exploitation of black South Africans, in the careful protection of resources for the sake of a white minority. There's a sort of universal confession that was sinful, that was the wrong thing to do. But my real question is, how come they didn't know? How come the church did not know at the time? Did they not have the language? Did they not have the eyes to see? Did they not have the ears to hear? And if they did have eyes to see and ears to hear, did they not have the capacity within the church to engage the injustice, So what does it take to engage that injustice? Those are questions I want to kind of us all to wrestle with.
Great. Well, we've got some things on the table now. So we'd like to open it up and talk particularly about what you've heard with regard to these kind of 5 ways of thinking about justice and what's involved in that. You have your choice. You can direct a question, specifically to one of the panelists, or just leave it out there generally, and we'll see who wants to tackle it. And we'll just hopefully go back and forth with questions, comments, feedback, that kind of thing. So anybody like to start us off? Raise your hand high so I can kind of see you above the heads. Okay, please take it away. Here we go.
There's this quote that always plays in my mind, and it's Dr. Cornel West, and he says that justice is what justice looks love. How does it work? Justice looks like love in public, right? So I guess I just want to hear your opinion on that. Is there love in justice?
Good. I think the question is, it's a quote from Cornel West. Justice looks like love.
Justice is what love looks like.
Yes.
Justice is what love looks like in public. Yes. For me, especially as a Christian, that comes back to what I understand as the very nature, the holy nature of God, and what we might even call the heart of God. And God's love for people is not only that love that's expressed in Christ Jesus, that is the forgiveness of sins, that we can be saved. It is much more than that. It is a love for God's people that includes that those who are oppressed, the different places in Scripture that talk about widows and orphans, the places all through, especially the prophets, that talk about systems and injustice, where God is even angry toward those who are perpetuating these systems that oppress the poor. But all of that is an expression of God's love, that you wouldn't want to divorce that from God's love. As God loves the world, including people, that includes all the people in the world. And so does that make God angry, if you will? Is God standing with the oppressed and against the oppressor? That tends to be the way that works out in the narratives, especially thinking about the Old Testament. And in fact, I'd like to see, we've got a biblical scholar, an Old Testament scholar here, and so maybe just checking back and seeing if you have a response to that.
No, that's good. Yeah, I mean, there is a grounding to all the talk that goes on with regard to justice in books like the prophets and so forth. It's not just kind of justice on its own, but grounded in both the character of God and what they understand the character of God's people to be in light of the character of God. So yeah, definitely sort of seconding that. Would anyone like to get in, either along that same line or shifting slightly from that opening question? Who else?
We still have,
please, go ahead.
we have a big problem of hermeneutics. Interpretation is an issue because how do we interpret the justice of God? It is a theological issue. How do we understand God's justice? I remember some of the writings of, I even forgot his name, very important. He said, let's not talk about the justice of God, because if we talk about his justice, we will be in hell. It's better to think about the injustice of God, because his injustice is mercy, love, and forgiveness. In terms of the mission of the church, if the church is the visible, tangible, active expression of the invisible God in the world today, we will be expressing his justice. But here again, how do we understand justice? The justice of God's people. Just for our discussion.
Yeah. Jamie or Dr. Smith, do you want to tie that in a little bit into kind of the landscape that we've been sort of charting here?
So it's much more palatable to talk about God's mercy, God's love, God's forgiveness. When we start talking about God's justice, It gets us nervous because there are paths you can take to that conversation that are difficult paths to walk down because they're difficult in the right kind of ways, and there are paths you can walk down in which they're difficult in the wrong kind of ways. So many people have used the theology of God's justice as a tool to bludgeon the very people who God cares about most. So in the apartheid government, justice was always a language of the government, language from the pulpit, and God was meting out God's justice for the sake of a people, but a very limited range of people. So with Christina here, I want to quickly come to the love and how justice of God is wrapped up in the character of mercy and love. One of my favorite passages is Psalm 85:10, because it connects all of those things at the same time. Psalm 85:10 says that the steadfast love and faithfulness will meet. Righteousness or justice and peace shall kiss one another. It's in one of the most beautiful images of the relationship between chesed, I think is the Hebrew word, steadfast love, and faithfulness. I'm not sure the Hebrew word there. I think it's ehed or something like that.
It depends.
But faithfulness, it ties together love, steadfast love, chesed, one of the most beautiful concepts of God's character, with faithfulness, a sense of always being present, but it ties justice and shalom, right? Tzedek, I believe, is the word for justice. And shalom is this really full sense of things being set right in the world, or at harmony in the world, or restored to what they were intended to be, in their fullness. Is that a fair semantic domain for shalom? And so, I think they all belong together, but there is an element of judgment and justice that is in God's character that makes it not okay to oppress the widow and the orphan and the stranger. It makes for consequences for those that oppress the widow and the orphan and the stranger. So that means saying, no, basta, stop. And finding ways to say that in ways that are also consistent with the character of God. So maybe we got to investigate, are the systems of justice that are in place, are they consistent with the character of God?
Dr. Benefiel, make a comment here to that question and to Dr. Gates' response. Why is it so hard for Christians to agree on what God's justice is? Why is that not a more straightforward? Why is there not a more straightforward answer to that question?
Yeah, thank you. And I think you're right. There is a hermeneutical question here. There are two quick responses. First of all, I think you're pointing out a really good distinction. But on the one hand, there is all of us before God, that God's justice, especially thinking soteriologically, that all of us deserve, especially in classical Christian theology, don't deserve any justice from God, but it's only the love and mercy of God. Then there's the other way of thinking about justice, which really has to do with these social systems. But then as we're participating now in the life of God, that as we're participating, that is also in the mission of God in the world, which is the justice of God. And that, and I would be interested in coming back to you at the end here, if you would also talk about, especially in the Old Testament, if there are different ways the Old Testament talks about justice as well. But one of those would certainly be this social systems, and that God then standing on the side of the oppressed and invites us to take up residence among the oppressed and to speak out against the oppressors, that's part of our participation in the life and mission of God in the world. I think the other way, especially think of the hermeneutics here, of these five, and I mentioned that they're sort of right to left, that one of the things that's very interesting sociologically is that our, as it turns out, generally speaking, our social status, or you might even say how much money we have, that our social status is very powerful predictor of our, not only of our politics, but our theological interpretations. And that has to do with justice as well. And so that if you were looking at these being right to left, they are the ways that people gravitate towards a definition of justice tends to match up fairly well on the political spectrum. And that also tends to match up fairly well with regard to how much power people do or don't have in society. So people who already have power, or maybe money or high socioeconomic status, are looking for theologies and politics, things that perpetuate their position and legitimate their right to what they have in society. The language of justice is a useful language in hermeneutics, in the perpetuation of the current means of power. On the other hand, if the powerless are looking for languages of justice that challenge the system. And so there is this continuum that's very political and very much tied to socioeconomic status.
Thank you. Keegan, I saw your hand a moment ago. Join in here. What were you going to say?
I was just going to say that it's really good to link up justice with love, because especially when you look at the retributive justice, that can so easily turn into violence and a cycle of violence, but violence is just not compatible with love.
It's not by accident that we have the name of the center as the Center for Justice and Reconciliation. Because if justice is an end in itself, and not tied to the character of God, not tied to a mission, a Missio Dei, which is indeed in Jewish terms we might say the tikkun olam, in one sense, the healing of the rift, the healing of it all that has been broken, that has been marred. Then it becomes an idol, or it becomes, it's a little bit my concern with the language of social justice, and with a strictly legal understanding of justice is that it's so unidimensional, and it has the danger, for in Christian terms, of becoming an end in itself, meaning that as long as we have accomplished, an eye for an eye, or as long as we have accomplished a more egalitarian justice system, that now means we've entered into the kingdom of God. I would say if we've created a system where people have stopped being exploited or are not flourishing, that it looks a whole lot more like the kingdom of God. But that's not the sum total of the kingdom of God. So reconciliation is like, can you bring about justice in a way that, let's say if it's between two parties, can you bring about justice in such a way that in the end of that process, the two can be reconciled to one another and to God?
Okay, thank you. I see a hand in the far back there.
And Brad, I would like to come back and just taking advantage of you and getting into the conversation. Scriptural ways, Old Testament, different ways that it talks about justice.
The short story of this is that there are it's often thought of that there are kind of two trajectories of justice within the Old Testament that would go under your names of the retributive and the distributive. So the retributive being sort of the punishment, reward, eye for an eye. Distributive being the exactly what it sounds like, the distribution of resources and goods and access to in a fair way across a community and society. It's interesting that you will hear sometimes people identify retributive as the definition of justice. You may, in fact, hear someone say what the root meaning of justice is to give someone their due, right? To give them what they have earned, right? And in a manner of speaking, that is what retributive justice is, but it's one very narrow understanding of what's going on in the Old Testament. And I think the argument can be made persuasively that really there's only one concept of justice in the Old Testament, and it's the distributive justice. And that retributive only comes in as a part of moving toward and correcting mistakes that have been made with regard to the distribution of things justly. That it's not a trajectory on its own. It serves only to correct mistakes, correct injustice, and is there for that purpose. But however you think about it, I mean, the one thing, kind of go back to what you said, the one thing the Old Testament is sort of clear on is, well, I say two things. The root of justice is in the character of God. It's not in the character of communities or persons, as it is for Aristotle, right? But it's in the character of God. And secondly, the goal of all justice is to establish a shalom community. That is a community where no one's in need, no one lacks unfairly. So all justice is sort of measured by that goal. So it's an interesting conversation, but I think sometimes we give the Old Testament a little bit of the short end of the stick by saying it's all this retributive stuff, and I'm not sure that's a fair sort of reading on it. Let's go back. I cannot see who the hand was in the back. Oh yes, please, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess I've been really interested in hearing what your definitions of justice are, but I'd like to hear more about what you think justice really looks like, because I think churches have been really good about certain aspects of justice, being active in the community, that kind of thing, but really in the way we talk about justice, we talk about the oppressed, and we talk about fighting for justice, which means there must be oppressors. And when we're fighting for justice, often that means we're fighting very specific people. And we talk about love, but then there's this other side to justice where we have to fight as Christians. So I guess I want to know how you think the church can make sense of that, of the loving for the oppressed, but there's a certain violence to it almost, the fighting for justice.
What does justice look like?
Yeah, thank you. Let me respond with this way. In Los Angeles, we began to think about how we responded in our ministry to people who were in need. And it was almost a developmental process. And so the beginning place was crisis intervention, that we had access to food and there were people who were hungry. And it was how we could put food into the hands of those who were hungry or other kinds of resources. So it was relief, so it was crisis intervention. After we were doing that for a while, we came to the place where we recognized that we may also be perpetuating some, the worst case of it might be described as making people comfortable in their irresponsibility, as we were sort of sustaining people but not necessarily giving them the tools to move ahead on their own. And so that led us then to programs and ministries of development, and those development ended up being education and job training in particular. As we were doing that, we recognized over time that we were able to take a few people out of the system, that there were kids that were on their way to being in gangs, or that there were people who were homeless, so we could pluck people out one at a time and do some personal development and at their best sort of help them to stand up and sometimes move out of the city. But that was sort of that wasn't dealing with the broader issues. That moved us then to another level, and that was why are there? It's not just how do we respond to a few people who are in gangs and trying to get them out of gangs, but the question of why are there gangs in Los Angeles? So that led us to working with the different agencies in what we've been moved from personal development programs to community development. And in community development, it would be partnering then with the schools and the police force, the city council, working for the shalom of the city. Once we were doing that, we also recognized that there were systems that needed to be challenged. And so the fourth move was advocacy. And so what that began to look like is, because we had the experience of working in ministry to and among the poor, and had established a certain reputation of that in the city, we had a voice that the people who we were serving often didn't have. And it put us in a position of using that voice to speak, if you will, to the powers, to those in city council, or to those that we were actually working with for the shalom of the city. It gave us access. So I'm not necessarily sure that justice can always just move right to advocacy without the hard work of crisis intervention and ministries of development. That's a sort of earning your right to speak in a community, even if those you're speaking for are the voiceless. So what that looks like, I think, is sort of progressive and developmental in that sense.
Couple.
Jonathan also.
And you pay a high price for that, right? In different societies, that takes.
That's correct, yes.
If you watch Romero in El Salvador, doing the right things you were doing in LA, but he was killed.
That's right.
So you're
Speaking,
right.
yeah, that old quote from, who was it who said, I fed the poor and they called me a saint. I asked them why the poor are poor. They called me a communist.
So, I mean, I don't know where you're at now. There's a couple of temptations to kind of avoid in this justice conversation. And one of the great temptations for those of us really concerned about justice is to take the kind of heroic route, what I call the heroic route, as opposed to the route of the cross. The heroic route would be, let's fix it. Let's get out there, find out what's wrong, and fix it. And the way we do that is work with the systems that exist, speak to the people in power. Maybe we have to turn them upside down sometime and fix it. The path of the cross is, I'm going to walk amongst. I'm going to get involved. I'm going to be amongst. And from amongst, people are going to notice I'm there. I'm going to notice I'm there. I become a part of the community that needs fixed. And so, I think of the large communities as a great example of this, right? So large communities, Jean Vanier and Henry Nouwen lived in a large community, the Arc in French, right? Where they look at the oppression that was happening for people who have physical and mental disabilities, and they were looking for a way to engage systemically in fixing the way people were being put into institutions and just being abandoned. And this is the the widows and orphans and strangers of the time, and even today. So the solution that came up was the people that are involved in large spend a little bit of time on changing the policies in the government that in each of the countries that they're planted to make the policies less harsh on people who don't have, who are in their community. But they do that by creating communities of able-bodied and disable-bodied and more able folks and less able folks around lots of different dimensions living together, creating homes where they're no longer marginalized in any way, where they have the folks that are at the home, both able-bodied and disabled, have jobs, employment. They create them from within. I like that model. I like the sense in which it calls those that participate in the acts of justice to first kind of confess, first get sort of this direct connection and involved. But then, the heroic move, I think, that I'm trying to say is not a particularly Christian move. Is often a whole lot more about the people getting engaged in the fight than it is about what the fight is about. So even though I hesitate with the language of fight, Anna, just is fight the kind of language you want to use when there's something to be, harshly opposed? But do we want to resort to military language to oppose it, or is there a more profound and powerful opposition than fighting?
Thanks. Please.
I think of those songs we often sing in chapel, the ways we've grieved your heart. Oh, have mercy, Christ, have mercy. The ways that we've loved in part. Oh, Lord, have mercy on us. And this idea that hope for justice includes that those who participate in the perpetuation of injustice would be something different. That I think of Isaiah 61, where the Lord says, like, the Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me because the Lord has anointed me to preach good news to the poor, to claim freedom, to declare the day of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God. That this idea that through God's love and mercy, we are transformed to be agents of justice. That we can't forget that the people who participate, who oppress, are people, and that our lives and these systems of injustice are so complicated and steeped in that. I have been a participant in the oppressing of the poor in my, like, as people that, if we want to bring justice and want to participate in bringing justice, then we need love and mercy to be transformed into people who oppress no more. And that's a more complete image of hope. That we regard people as being transformed into agents of justice.
Can I give a quick story? A quick story from the work we're doing together on human trafficking. And I think this speaks to Anna's question as well. So what does this look like? There's an entire, you might call, industry of people, social service agencies, law enforcement, educators, people really concerned about human trafficking going on in San Diego, Tijuana right now. And we're heavily involved in those conversations and with the people trying to figure out what to do about it. It's far more real than any of us realize, and we're coming to find out that it's in our face a whole lot more than we knew. But there are very deep divisions over the notion of justice, what justice would look like in the end, once we do something about this. And so you get law enforcement that is heavily, interested in arresting and incarcerating. And you get social service agencies who are very interested in rescuing. And the language is victim and perpetrator. I have a pastor friend who is now a documentarian, who has gone underground for a couple of years and has been moving in amongst the gangs and under the auspices of doing a documentary, and has gotten very strong access. He's pastor. He's Christian first, and sort of documentarian second. And he just this last week we had lunch, and there's a way in which he talks about the pimps, and this is for the sex trafficking part of this, as broken people in need of redemption. And that systemically, we're not going to do much. We can incarcerate every single one of them. And systemically, we won't do much until we engage the pimps in a redemptive way. And until we stop sort of framing the whole issue as victims and pimps. There's a degree to which the, quote, victims are harshly hurt and victimized in the process. So there's no doubt that the label applies to a degree, but there's a degree in which their lives and their choices have participated in the life that they are engaged in. There's a range of, it's much more complicated than what we typically think. And this pastor spoke this prophetic word into the middle of what is typically a very polarized conversation. And that looks like justice, or a Christian version of justice to me. If we can begin to shape the categories, reshape the categories, and thereby reshape the kind of programs we create out of the language that we use.
Yeah. Ron, did you want to follow up?
Just real quickly, because if we don't look at people who perpetuate injustice as people, then no person has to take responsibility. Like if it just becomes like this inhuman thing that there's this elusive they, the oppressors, then it's how are we going to ever take that responsibility and acknowledge and address the issues that perpetuate themselves?
Can I also just add that I think one thing you said that we're all sort of participating in these systems, and I think a really good place for the church to begin when it's looking at issues of justice is confession. And that it's not necessarily starting with sort of righteous indignation, but we can confession. Having said that, when we're thinking about participating in the very life and mission of God in the world, that it certainly makes sense that we want to love as God loves. Okay, we're good with that. And the next one is maybe, well, does it also make sense that the things that break the heart of God would also break our heart? I like that. But there's one more that we probably don't go with. The things that make God angry. So beginning with confession, but the things that make God angry, are we willing to let that permeate us as well? Not in a way that starts with a righteous indignation, starts with confession, but ends also with receiving the anger of God for the injustice in the world and joining God in that.
Curtis, we've had you on hold for a couple seconds here. Come on in.
I was just thinking about, reconciling with oppressors and things like that. It brings me back to the uproar when Bin Laden was killed and Obama says justice has been served. And social media just blows up, and most people rejoice and are glad that this has happened. And then those who speak out and say, well, this man was loved by God too, and our goal should have been, hopefully at some point he could have been reconciled into a community with us, however possible that is. But it's just something where you can see like the strength of retributive justice, like in our society.
So in South Africa, when in a few years following apartheid, a friend of mine, Mandela Mashanini, he was, like head boy at his school, head of ASP at his school, was body president. In Soweto, one of the places where apartheid's arm really reached the deepest and the harshest. And he has so many stories of like police raiding his school, white police officers and military officers coming into school. One particularly really tough story he has, the part of his life that he tells, is when his then girlfriend, at the time, was shot by one of the police officers. And he tells, when we go there and meet with Mandela, he talks about how literally we're standing on the spot where his girlfriend was killed, where he literally held her while she was dying. And the whole time he's telling this story, and afterwards, as we discuss this at great length, never once, or every time he refers to the police officers and the white police officers, he talks about them as my brother and sister. And he's gotten to the place, and he says, he acknowledges it by the grace of God alone. He's a pastor, and he's somebody who's had to really wrestle with this notion of forgiveness. And he says that to begin there, that I can't. These are my Christian brothers, and I don't understand why Christian brothers, in this case brothers, were shooting at me. And we have to be reconciled with that. We have to figure out a way. And it demands confession. It demands forgiveness. It demands restitution. There are things that have to happen. It can't just be like, oh, I'm sorry. It's much deeper and richer. What we're called to is much deeper and richer than that.
Yeah. We have a question over here, please.
Yes. Has to go with all of that. How we want to forgive and love and show mercy, and at the same time repair things that are broken. At what point when we accept these people who were at once people who committed crimes or the perpetrators in these things, and we try to accept them as brothers, how do we go in part and they need to take responsibility for the consequences of their actions, perhaps? Where does that fall into the love and forgiveness? Like, for example, the Bin Laden thing. Are the consequences of his actions deserving of death, or are they not? Is that even a possibility that someone can do something where what's appropriate is their death, and even in that we can still forgive them? I'm trying to where to get at.
Let me use another example. There's a situation unfolding and see if this approaches at all. It's a very good and difficult question to answer. In Cambodia, in the killing fields of Cambodia, there were these prison camps, and following the death of Pol Pot there, and there was a move of evangelism or revival in Cambodia that included a lot of the people who had been the perpetrators of these crimes. One of those in particular is actually on trial right now, and he was head of a prison camp where there were an estimated 30,000 people who died, which was just a few of the million who died in that war. And he has become Christian. And so part of the challenge of the Christian community is to welcome him in. This goes back to actually the first century in Rome and all the confessors. But to welcome him into that community, how does a Christian community welcome somebody into the community who may have been responsible for killing their family? And so that is being played out right now. He's also in the courts where he is on trial for war crimes and is having to pay for that. So it's really complex, and I think the story sort of illustrates some of the complexity of all of that. It is not only how the church reconciles or what the church does with this person who is now declaring his faith in Jesus Christ and apparently has made a real conversion, but also then is still responsible, in this case, to the courts, not necessarily to the church, perhaps, but to the courts for the war crimes that he committed. You want to respond to that?
Okay, so I had for a while. Yeah, please.
So going along these lines, I've kind of been wondering, would you guys say there is a point at which someone is not redeemable? You know, there's someone who is a murderer of millions, someone who is, that evil. And is there, I feel like this is kind of going the way of human nature. Is there a point that, the Bible says the heart is desperately wicked, who can know it? And that's the basic nature of all humans. And the fact that many, are redeemed is a miracle. So is there a point that someone can't be redeemed?
Sometimes you just
How about
Put them down. What do you think?
How about a short comment, and then I'll let the theologians here wrestle with this. I would think that to not answer your question directly, but to come at it from another angle, is the sin of a lie worse than the sin of murder? If all have fallen short of the grace of God, or so all have fallen short, right? In some ways, it's really. Some people have done such atrocious things that it's a fairly clear picture of evil. But as I read Scripture, especially in the New Testament, that collapses the categorical differences between evil, I think. And what's the harder part of your question is to ask, in what ways am I like? In what ways is that me but for the grace of God? And then you turn the question around and say, would I want God to bring justice on me?
But as in a real life situation, is it better to eliminate that threat from other people than try to reconcile him while he's still on earth?
There are three perspectives in all of that. Can this person be forgiven by God? God is the judge, I don't know. What should happen in society in terms of war crimes that Hitler committed? I think then there is also then the church. What's the place of the church? And the place of the church always leads with reconciliation. And if there's someone who can be reconciled. But let me tell you a story. Vietnam Bob showed up at our church. And he was very sincere. He was very positive response to sermons. He wanted to be baptized. We baptized him in a swimming pool. And he became a true believer. He was socially awkward, an overly sort of machismo presentation of self. He began showing an inordinate and uncomfortable interest in some of the young adult women. And we tried to come alongside him and say, this is a little inappropriate. We want to help you here. But he seemed to go past the stop signs and made some of the women very uncomfortable. We then assigned one of our young adult men to walk with him, and we told him, we want you to be part of our congregation, and Scott is going to be the one who is helping you, and so stay close to Scott, and because you're making some of the women uncomfortable in the church fellowship. Well, he went past that stop sign, and one of the young women who was feeling pretty uncomfortable, her boyfriend happened to be a police officer and was able to access his record and found out that he had spent years in prison, and there were multiple records of both molestation, child molestation, rape, kidnapping, and attempted murder. And with that rap sheet, that became a real warning sign for us. He became and actually began showing up at our home when Janet was still pregnant with one of our children, and she hid and got the girls to hide. I think it was when Tim was still in the making. And he'd knock on the door, and Janet would hide and tell the girls to be quiet. He would call, and his violent anger. And we tried again to do everything that we could reconcile. He was irreconcilable. And then there was the day that came that we heard the news that in his apartment complex there had been a man and another Vietnam vet in a wheelchair playing a game of chess down in the lobby, and Vietnam Bob came down, they exchanged words, made Vietnam Bob angry. He went up to his apartment, got a gun, came down and shot and killed the man, and went up to his room. The SWAT team came, and he committed suicide. It was a terrible, terrible story. Are there people who the reason that's important is because he was one of two people in the 20 years we were at LA First, Kevin, one of two people who we had to say, virtually we had to excommunicate. We had to say, you can't be here anymore. And so even in that action, practically speaking, there is that sense of, are there people who can't be reconciled? And it wasn't because we didn't want to reconcile. And he certainly wanted to be part of the church, but that it could not be reconciled. And sort of that symbol of putting him out of the church was also a very painful symbol of saying, God have mercy on your soul.
That is a difficult topic, one that deserves a lot more conversation than just what we've been able to give it here. But we're almost at time. We've got about 3 minutes.